All right, this is our third set of notes in section two. Continuing on with our discussion of television and different television programming, one of the most successful television programming avenues was quiz shows. Quiz shows started out in radio during the Depression era. People just loved to see the underdog make money on these quiz shows, or in the radio days, they actually heard them make money. So it was kind of one of those things that people just really, really enjoyed listening to and then eventually watching on TV. Just a kind of a quick synopsis of where the quiz shows began. It did begin on radio. By 1940, there were over 50 quiz shows on radio. They kind of dried up during World War II because most of the people really wanted to listen to news and information about what was going on with the war. We see one of the big quiz shows that started out in the radio world as a successful radio program really jump in and take off on TV after World War II. But one of the shows that really saw a rebirth after World War II was something called Stop the Music with Bert Parks. And if you get an opportunity to Google that, you can watch, I think there's one or two of the old shows still on YouTube, but it's kind of hilarious. They get on the phone, and it really is one of those shows that almost like Name That Tune when that came out on TV, in the late 70s. It's just kind of one of those reoccurring quiz show genres that people really enjoyed watching, and we saw a rebirth of many of those types of shows in different decades of television. Another popular quiz show called the $64 Question. And no, that's not a typo. It really was called the $64 Question. And it was created by Louis Cohen, who produced Stop the Music, or created Stop the Music on radio. So he had a successful show, and then he brought this other show called the $64 Question. And basically, it was a show that, as you answer more questions, the prize money got bigger and bigger, with the grand prize being $64. So, we kind of laugh at that today. $64 is kind of an interesting thing. But the show was semi-successful, but wasn't really, really as successful as Stop the Music. And so one of the things that Cohen did was he knew he was either going to lose the show because of its lack of popularity. And so one of the things he did was he changed the grand prize to $64,000. And so that was really the big change, and people started watching it. So he changed the title of the show to the $64,000 Question and changed the grand prize to from $64 to $64,000. And from that point on, the show was a huge, huge success. One of the reasons that they equate quiz show successes is the fact that usually those quiz shows take place during an economic downturn in the economy, and people really, really like to see, like I said, people win the grand prize. During the height of the $64,000 Question TV show, the average income in the United States was only $5,000. So just see by that alone, if you could go on and make $64,000, that was huge. We had multiple thousands and thousands of people sending in letters trying to get on that quiz show because they knew if they could get that $64,000 question, and just like any other quiz show you see on TV, as you're watching it, it's easy to answer the questions, but when you're on it, it's not. But basically, the $64,000 Question opened the floodgates and just proved to TV producers that this quiz show production genre was one that needed to be duplicated over and over again because of its success. And then we saw a great number of quiz shows on TV by the late 1950s. We had a little bit of a scandal with the quiz shows eventually, but in the years between 1957 and 1958, there was 22 quiz shows on the air on TV. The shows were run by sponsors such as Revlon and any other soap or makeup advertiser. They were very cheap to produce. They really had to build just a small little studio set in their television studios at the networks. What happened though is the advertisers and the networks got a little greedy, and they knew, or they could see, that they could start manipulating these quiz shows and start honing them in so we wouldn't have a winner for a while, or we could tell by the rating points that the audience members liked a certain contestant over other contestants. And so we saw this manipulation of the results of the quiz shows starting to enter in. And we had one show in particular called 21. It aired on NBC, and basically we had a contestant named Charles Van Doren, who was a college professor, very successful looking gentleman. And so the audience members tuned in every week to see if Charles Van Doren could reach that $64,000 question level. We had one major problem with this TV scenario in the fact that Herbert Stempel, who was Charles Van Doren's competition on the show, basically revealed to America that the television producers, the sponsors who run the TV producers, asked him to give the wrong answers in advance, even though he knew the correct answer. So it came out that this was a major, major scandal in the television industry. Basically, Stempel blew the whistle on the TV producers. Like I mentioned, the producers wanted to manipulate it. They wanted Van Doren to win. They didn't want Stempel to win. Both contestants were told to fidget and pretend not to know the answers. Although both knew the correct answers, they were told the answers in advance. The $64,000 question during the scandalous year, Geritol was the main sponsor, and they really pressured the show's producers to, in fact, rig the show, because if they could rig it and almost produce it from start to finish and know how it was going to turn out, then they could have more control over it. Almost like, and in fact it is a lot like, the reality shows of today. Reality shows, if you don't know this, they're totally 100% scripted. And that makes sense after I said that, and then you go back and watch these shows. The next big TV programming trend that we see to become popular was TV westerns. By 1960, 20% of all network primetime television was TV westerns. Westerns began its popularity with kids. We had the show called Roy Rogers. So we see westerns first initially taken off for kids programming, and then the adult western kicks in. And by the 1950s, Gunsmoke was the TV show that really hit #1 in the TV westerns. It was on the air for quite a while. Some of the other TV shows for westerns were called Wagon Train, Maverick, Have Gun Will Travel. By 1960, though, the TV show Bonanza was the big winner as far as rating points, and so it would continue for quite a while. After the fall of westerns, which was kind of the mid-late 1960s up to the early 1970s, basically due to the fact that Vietnam War/conflict was taking place, and so after the Vietnam War ended, the TV western genre never really could come back after that. Unlike quiz shows really came and go, but every time they came back, they were very successful. So westerns kind of saw its demise during the Vietnam War. Now, another very, very popular television programming trend, and still is sports broadcasting. Basically, sports broadcasting began with what was called the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961. And basically, this act negotiated the sale of national broadcast rights. Football, baseball, basketball, hockey to some extent back then, but it wasn't that popular yet. Really saw that this could be a really huge money-making avenue for that sports, and in fact, as we see today, it's a huge moneymaker. The Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961 did a couple things, and I'm going to read this verbatim. It granted antitrust immunity to any agreement among the clubs in professional baseball, basketball, football, and hockey to pool and sell their broadcast rights to sponsored telecasts of league games. So it really solidified the league, whatever league it was, baseball, basketball, football, and hockey, to guarantee the fact that they could sell their broadcasting rights to a network in order to gain monetary value, and it turned out to be a huge success. What this act did not grant, it did not grant immunity to college sports. College still pooled their rights to a weekly, regional, and national telecast, and that pretty much exists today, other than NBC signing a huge contract with Notre Dame. So what we see now today is the Big Ten Network doing the Big Ten games. We see the SEC Network doing the SEC. So we see these regional sports things doing their own broadcast, if you will. Now, when we get to the championship games in college sports, that's a little different game, a little different ball game, and there's a major contact track going on. But just so you know, with your exam, the Sports Broadcasting Act of 1961 was for professional sports only. It did not affect college sports. TV programming in the 70s, we're going to be talking about that. We have something called a taboo, and we're talking about that here in a minute, taboo programming. But basically, TV programming changed dramatically in the 1970s, and we'll talk about some different things. For the first time, we see, other than the I Love Lucy show, we see Mary Tyler Moore, which premiered in 1970. It showcased a single working woman. Now, you might think, well, what's the big deal about that? But back in the 70s, if you read anything about what went on in the 70s, you know this was a major obstacle to overcome. And for TV producers to produce a show around a single working woman was a major step forward in women's rights and just women's in general that was really never heard of. So they took a big step or big chance in producing a show like this, but it was very successful. News became the mainstay in the U.S. home, especially after the Vietnam War happened. People were glued to the TV sets almost like they are now today with terrorism. The Vietnam War was really considered the first TV war. Up until this point, the wars prior to Vietnam, we just saw newsreels and government-controlled images of what came out, what news came out of that conflict or that war. But the Vietnam War, we had the networks on the ground embedded in the troops, and so we saw firsthand the good and the bad of war. So in your notes, just underline that Vietnam was considered the first TV war. Sitcoms were also introduced in the 1970s. They started coming out in the 60s, but they really became popular in the 1970s. We went from a 1960s show called Ozzie and Harriet all the way to the Brady Bunch. A producer by the name of Norman Lear really wanted to showcase how American life was in the 70s, the problems that we were facing. And so he created this new TV genre called the social consciousness. And he had shows like All in the Family, which broke down a lot of TV barriers, politics, women's rights, homosexuality came out in that show. If you haven't watched an episode of All in the Family, please go on YouTube and watch it. It's a hilarious sitcom, but you'll notice that as long as you keep in the frame of mind that this took place in the 1970s, all the things that they talk about that Norman Lear actually brought out in the show was an amazing accomplishment by this producer. The genre social consciousness programming took off in the 70s, and we see many spin-offs that came onto TV after All in the Family was a success. And so we see it's always been that trend, even with the radio. Once something took off and it was a proven success, other producers started creating their programs based around that, just like reality TV is today. By the mid-70s, we kind of saw the TV programming turn to more of the lighter side of things. We needed to laugh. We needed to just kind of let go and not worry about things. So we saw shows like Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, The Little House on the Prairie, and those were huge hits in the 1970s. The Waltons was a huge success on CBS during the 70s. Basically, it showcased American life during the Depression. Why we wanted to see that, I'm not sure. I think it was enough removed in time to then go back and watch it, but it was a huge success. The other thing that the mid-1970s TV programming came out, and this is kind of where it gets into the taboo programming, we have a new TV genre called Jiggle TV. And Jiggle TV, for you guys that kind of laughed when you just saw that, it is what you think it is. So we see TV shows like Charlie's Angels, Three's Company, all centered around a sexual gratification and / humor. And they called that Jiggle TV. And it was a huge success. We had beautiful women on these TV shows, and right or wrong, that TV programming style actually worked. We also saw something called fantasy TV show up in the 1970s with Fantasy Island, Love Boat, and other shows like that. And those were big hits too. The highly successful variety show that we saw in the 1950s and 1960s basically had its last run in the 70s. We saw shows like The Carol Burnett Show, The Flip Wilson Show, Sonny and Cher, Tony Orlando and Dawn, Donnie and Marie. We had a lot of these variety shows pop up in the 50s and 60s, and they were a huge hit. But they basically had their last run in the late 70s, and they just kind of filtered out. Now, some people say that the comedy variety show is kind of like The Voice or some of the other ones, but it's not the same kind of format. If you Google The Carol Burnett Show or Flip Wilson Show or Sonny and Cher, it's different. Even though there was some music and comedy involved in it, it's nothing like any show that airs today. If we jump from the late 70s to the early 90s, we see the insurgence of primetime dramas. Now, I'm going to tell you, primetime dramas had their success from daytime soap operas. And primetime dramas they were basically soap operas produced for men. All right, they were shows that men could finally admit to watching, even though we know from ratings that men did watch daytime dramas if they were home. But basically, primetime dramas were soap operas created for both men and women, but really created more so for the man to watch. Primetime dramas haven't hit the longevity of soap operas, but we did see some major primetime drama hits. Short run, but huge rating points. Shows like Dallas, Dynasty, Beverly Hills 90210, Grey's Anatomy, Desperate Housewives, and you could go on with a laundry list of different ones, but these were some of the huge hits. Now, Dallas in particularly, when it came out, was just an amazing drama, and we had a couple spin-offs from that. The TV show Dallas was in the prime time from basically 1978 to 1991. It was the first primetime show to have a serial plot line like soap operas, and they called that melodramas. It also was the first U.S. show to be an international hit. It basically, Dallas masculinized the world of soap operas. So it was really the first show, primetime drama, that men really hooked onto and liked just as much as women, primarily because we had a lot of beautiful women in the show. So we kind of combined a couple different genres. We had the primetime drama, and the jiggle TV, if you will, was brought into that. So guys weren't ashamed to say that they were watching these shows. We had something called the Dallasification effect, where this noxious effect of American culture on European TV, people around the world really thought this is how Americans lived their lives based on the TV show Dallas. So on your exam 2, when you see Dallasification, that term was really used to showcase that Europeans and people around the world, when they watched American TV, really thought that Dallas was how Americans lived in this country. Some of the longest running TV shows in TV history, I'm going to go through a list of these, just kind of write them down, especially the first 5. You'll probably get these on the exam. Meet the Press. This show is still on TV, and it is the longest running TV show in American history. The next one is CBS Evening News. The third one is something called Music and the Spoken Word. This is a religious program that's still running today. The Today Show is number 4. World News is number 5. Believe it or not, The Tonight Show comes in at number 6. Face the Nation is number 7. It Is Written is another religious program. And just as a side note for your notes, this was the first religious TV show that was shown in color. Number 9 was something called The Open Mind. And number 10 is the NFL on CBS. So these are the top longest running TV shows in the United States. Okay. The next TV genre that we'll get into, again, that laundry list, I went through that kind of fast. You can just pause this video if you need to. But the next TV genre that we want to get into that we really saw an resurgence of was late night TV. The Tonight Show is in the top 10 longest running of these TV shows. Really, really has become a hit. The Tomorrow Show was another program that aired after The Tonight Show on NBC, and it ran from about 1973 to 1982. Of course, in 1993, David Letterman took over that time slot, the Tomorrow time slot, and then he basically, when Letterman was denied The Tonight Show, he left for CBS in 1993. ABC was kind of the underdog in the late night TV industry, but their longest running late night TV show is the Jimmy Kimmel, and as of 2016, it's been on the air for 13 years. Now, NBC came out with an interesting late-night program called Saturday Night Live, which initially featured Dan Aykroyd, Gilda Radner, John Belushi, Bill Murray, and something that was called the Not-For-Ready Primetime Players is what they were originally called. Saturday Night Live originally first aired on October 11th, 1975, and basically what was happening is NBC was trying to find a show for this Saturday Night Live time slot. They didn't know where it would fit. They didn't know if they wanted to go on at 11:30, 12:30, whatever it might be. But they kind of settled on this Saturday night time slot. The weekend late night time slot was an untapped time slot. It was definitely a leap of faith to try to see if there was something available where people wanted to stay up that late and watch it. NBC basically wanted to attract an 18 to 35-year-old age demographic. And they kind of knew that maybe they were up that late on Saturday nights. Saturday Night Live basically featured a lot of big star guest hosts each week. George Carlin was the very first host of Saturday Night Live. I'd underline that for your notes. Saturday Night Live was produced live for 90 minutes. They did a rehearsal show prior to that on Saturday, but when they went on, it was live, and today still is, other than the reruns that they show too many times, in my opinion. Saturday Night Live is basically considered to be one of the most distinctive and significant TV programs in TV history. Like I said, NBC took a leap of faith. They had no clue if it was going to work, but it worked, and it worked huge. This particular TV show created memorable catchphrases. If you're a Saturday Night Live historical fan, "You Look Marvelous," Billy Crystal created that. "Isn't That Special" by the Church Lady, and that laundry list could go on and on and on. But we see some memorable TV catchphrases come out of Saturday Night Live. If we move from the 1980s into the 1990s, we see a couple things that happened with the FCC. Something called the Fairness Doctrine basically was an attempt to ensure that all coverage of controversial issues by broadcast stations be balanced and fair. Kind of what Fox News does, or MSNBC does today, right? I'm being sarcastic there. But basically, by 1987, the FCC ended the Fairness Doctrine because it no longer had its intended effect. and a lot of people actually complained that the Fairness Doctrine actually could be violating the First Amendment right. So what the Fairness Doctrine actually attempted to do was, if you were a broadcast station or a broadcast network and you covered a controversial issue, they required you to cover equal time for both sides of the issue. And then by 1987, they basically ended that. Both houses of Congress voted to keep the doctrine, but Ronald Reagan, the president at the time, vetoed that law, and so the Fairness Doctrine ended. The only remnants left over from the Fairness Doctrine that still exists today is during election coverage. So the Fairness Doctrine and how it's left today with the election coverage is, if you give 10 minutes of time to the Democratic Party, you have to give equal time to the Republican Party, and so forth. So they have to, by law, create equal time during election coverage. They also cannot deny running the TV ads as long as they meet specific FCC regulations in the ads as well too. So just for your notes, the FCC's Fairness Doctrine no longer exists in TV except during election coverage. Something else we see happen between the 1980s and the 1990s, we see the end of what's called the FinCEN rules. And now the FinCEN stands for Financial Interest and Syndication Rules. What basically happened was the FCC implemented these rules in 1970, attempting to, sorry about that typo there, they attempted to increase program diversity and limit the market control to three TV networks. What they were afraid of happening here is one business taking total control over the TV markets. And what you'd have happen was one voice doing everything in the market, and so they were afraid that they would leave out a certain part of the community's voice or whatever it might be. This rule basically prohibited networks for participation in the creation of in-house syndication arms. So ABC, CBS, and NBC, which this was all that was basically around at this time, it was geared to keep them out of the syndication business. It limited the amount of primetime programming that networks could produce themselves. The government, at least, was very skeptical of, could the networks basically police themselves and get them out of the financial greediness, if you will, of producing TV programs. So the government really wanted to take control over that. The hope was that these rules would benefit independent TV producers by making them more involved in the syndication market and keeping the big boys at the time, ABC, CBS, and NBC, out of that business. Obviously, the networks fought from the start. They hated this rule. They felt it was unfair. They felt that they had the right to produce whatever they wanted to and try to recoup some of the money or their investments they had built up for the networks. By November of 1995, the FinCEN rules were basically eliminated. These rules were formed prior to cable, prior to any of the stuff going on today. We basically only had the three networks. And by 1995, what we saw happening was the three main networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, had a very low audience pull compared to the cable market. So the FinCEN rules really didn't make sense by this time. The networks didn't have the pull they had back in the 70s and the 80s and 90s, so the FinCEN rules were eliminated. In the 80s and the 1990s, we see cheap programming going on. We see the start of reality TV. In the late 90s, early 2000s, we see the Kardashians, Survivor, The Voice. Even up to today, we see those. Really, we have a niche market going on. These shows are very successful. We see what's happening here is the big three audience, and when I say the big three, it's NBC, CBS, and ABC. Their shares declined 69% by 1995 from 91% in 79. So we see a major shift from the network viewing over to cable programming, DirecTV programming, and as of today, we're starting to see a huge increase in Netflix and Hulu and other avenues of that direction. One of the big reasons that we see a decline in network programming is because of the introduction of cable TV. And in our third set of notes for the final exam, we'll get into more detail for cable television. We see VCRs being introduced in 75 and 76, so now we could record programs and play them back. And there was no way back then to know if anybody recorded a TV show on their VCRs like there is with DVRs today. VCRs brought something into our world called time shifting. We see movie rentals taking off, so we really see a move from watching live TV to now watching something other than live TV. DVRs started around 1999, and even though satellite TV started in 1976, the huge boom of satellite TV really didn't take off until the 80s and 90s where we came out with the smaller dishes. Prior to that, we had to have a really huge 15-foot dish either mounted on the top of your home if you had the support system or on a huge pole outside of your house. And still today, you might see some older homes have these old huge dishes outside. They're not being used today. So we see a major shift, and as far as your notes go, we see a major decline of network viewership between 1980 and basically the mid 2000s. I should almost change that, for, that top title there, because we do see another movement into another avenue of viewership going to Netflix and Hulu and some other things. So, and that was basically the reason they got rid of the FinCEN rules, is because we had a lot of other avenues or another to watch TV from other places other than the big three networks. All right, that ends the set of notes for section 2. And our exam 2 will be on Wednesday from 9 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. You'll have an hour to take this exam, just like exam 1. And again, there are no makeups unless they're pre-approved by me.